It didn't feel permanent when it happened. It felt practical, a simple decision, temporary, reversible, something you could change. Later, you told yourself that. Everyone does. That's how it starts. But that's not what actually happens. The decision itself is rarely the problem. It's what the decision starts, because once you choose something, a path, a role, a direction, you don't just move forward. You begin to adjust, subtly, quietly, almost. INVISIBLY. Your behavior shifts to support the decision. Then your thinking shifts to justify it. That part comes later, and without noticing, you begin to become the kind of person who would make that decision again. That's the shift. At what point does a decision stop being something you made and start becoming something you are? There's no signal when it happens. No warning. Most people just never see where they crossed it. It starts with reinforcement, not dramatic reinforcement. Small confirmations. Just enough. You make a decision. It works just enough. You get a result, or at least you avoid a problem. And that's enough. Your brain marks it. This was correct. So you repeat it, not consciously, but consistently. And then something shifts. Quietly. The decision stops being evaluated. It starts being assumed. Now you're not choosing anymore. You're maintaining. Every repetition strengthens the structure. Every confirmation removes doubt. Every step forward removes something else. This is where the illusion lives. Because from the inside, it feels like progress. It always does. You're getting better, more efficient, more aligned. Everything feels smoother. Less resistance. But what's actually happening is something else. Something slower, harder to see. Your options are collapsing. Not all at once. That would be obvious. Not visibly. That would be alarming. But structurally, that's what makes it dangerous. The paths you didn't take, they don't stay open. They fade. Your skills specialize. Your relationships align. Your environment adapts. And slowly, what was once a choice becomes the only thing that still feels natural. Here's the part most people miss. Nothing forces this. No one is pushing you. There's no moment where you lose control. That would be easier to see. It feels voluntary the entire time. That's the trick. Because you're not being pushed, you're being reinforced. And reinforcement doesn't feel like pressure, but it builds something stronger than pressure ever could. At this stage, everything looks stable. From the outside, you've built something, a career, a role, a system. It works. That's the problem. So there's no reason to question it. Why would there be? And that's exactly where it locks in, because stability is often just constraint that hasn't been challenged yet. Now the real shift happens, the one that doesn't reverse easily. Your decisions stop being external. They become internal. They become you. You don't just do the thing, you're the kind of person who does it. And once identity is involved, everything hardens. Everything. Because now changing the decision means questioning yourself. And most people won't do that. Not for long. Not because they can't, because it feels wrong. This is the loop. Decision, behavior, validation, identity, stronger decision, and every cycle through it tightens the structure. You gain clarity, but you lose flexibility. You gain certainty, but you lose range. And eventually, you lose something else. Perspective. You stop seeing alternatives as real. They don't feel like options anymore. They feel distant, like someone else's life. You don't just repeat the decision. You begin to filter reality through it. Without noticing. Opportunities that don't fit, you ignore them. Ideas that contradict it, you dismiss them. People who challenge it, you drift away. Quietly. And over time, your environment starts agreeing with you. More and more. Not because you're right. Because everything else left. This is how the system stabilizes. It doesn't force alignment. It removes misalignment. And once that happens, you lose contrast. And without contrast, you can't see clearly. Without clarity, you don't choose, you continue. There's another layer to this, one that doesn't show up until later. And when it does, it doesn't feel like a problem. It feels like reality. The longer you stay inside a decision, the more it starts to define what normal looks like. What once felt like a choice starts to feel like the only reasonable path. You stop comparing, you stop questioning, you stop imagining alternatives in any serious way. Not because you've proven this path is the best, but because everything else feels less real, less relevant, less possible. This is how identity quietly takes control, not by forcing behavior, but by shaping perception. You don't reject other paths outright. You just stop taking them seriously. And over time, that subtle shift becomes permanent. Because once something stops feeling like an option, it effectively isn't one, even if it still exists. This is the cost. Most people never calculate not what the decision gives you, but what it makes you unable to see. And the longer it continues, the deeper it embeds. Your language changes. The way you explain your life shifts. You begin to tell a story where this path was inevitable. It makes sense. It was always going to be this way. This is just who I am. But those aren't neutral observations. They're reinforcements. Each time you say them, you strengthen the structure. You make the decision harder to question, harder to challenge, harder to leave. And eventually, you don't just defend the decision, you defend the identity built around it. And that's where it becomes permanent. Not because you can't change, but because changing would require unraveling something you spent years building. Then one day, something shifts. Not externally. Internally. You try to imagine something different. A different path. A different version of yourself. And something strange happens. It doesn't land. It doesn't feel real. It feels wrong. Not because it's impossible, because it's no longer you. That's when you see it. Too late. The decision wasn't temporary. It embedded. You don't lose options when you make the decision. You lose them when you become consistent with it. Consistency feels like strength. It isn't always. Every time you align with the decision, you make it harder to leave it. Until eventually leaving doesn't feel like a decision anymore. It feels like damage, like breaking something that took years to build. And even when the thought crosses your mind, even when you see the pattern clearly, there's still resistance. Not logical resistance, emotional resistance. Because the decision isn't just something you did. It's something you've lived. Repeated. Reinforced. It holds your routines, relationships, your sense of progress. Walking away from it doesn't just mean changing direction. It means stepping into uncertainty, into unfamiliar territory, into a version of yourself you haven't practiced being. And most people avoid that not because they're weak, but because the system they built is doing exactly what it was designed to do: stabilize, protect, maintain, even if it comes at the cost of freedom. And that's the final layer. The decision doesn't trap you. It protects you from uncertainty, from doubt, from having to start over, which is why it's so hard to leave, because leaving doesn't just feel like risk, it feels like loss. Loss of identity, loss of stability, loss of everything that now feels familiar. And familiarity is one of the strongest forces there is. That's why these decisions embed so deeply, not because they're forced, but because they become comfortable. And comfort is what makes them last. So the real question isn't, is this the right decision? That question comes too early. The real question is this: what version of me does this decision make permanent if I keep repeating it? Because that's what stays, even when everything else changes.